So try this. What do you see? So when you look at this and you look at the initial picture itself, a lot of individuals will see different things, or two actually. They'll see two different elements within this picture. I'll kind of break it down. On one end, when you look at it straightforward, you see an older, elderly individual, grandmother with a scarf on, with a feather in her hair, everything else, kind of looking downwards. And so initially you have that. The other is a more youthful individual, a more youthful female individual looking off over her right shoulder. Again, same elements. You have the black hair, you have the feather in the hair. Also, and again, it's one of those things of our mind begins to interpret different things. We begin to see different things. We begin to understand different things based upon our initial upbringing, based upon our initial elements that are around us. So again, those are one of the things that you begin to notice, the initial optical illusions that that our brain initially interprets. So now, sensory systems. So again, our sensory systems are responsible for providing information about our surroundings.
Again, here you have sensation.
So again, when when you think about
receptors,
again, these are specialized neurons that respond to specific types of. So here's so looking at perception again. One of the things we're looking at is a sensory receptor of what initially is considered perception. So here is sensory adaptation, not perceiving stimuli.
So you have
relatively
what do I
constant
see?
over
So I'll play the video.
For example, the example that is given is the clock ticket plays. Say, for example, you enter a
quiet room, or
so
you
initially enter
the
the
room
room itself, and you can hear the instructions count how many times the player wearing past the ticking itself, the basketball. But as you begin to stay in that room for a longer period of time, initially you become unaware of it. In other words, you're just counting that. You're just counting
noise
how
is
many
not
times
as
distracting. Again, that's where you begin to take your mind off of it. You begin to hear other sounds as well. And then you also have what is considered, with the area of attention, you have what is considered inattentional blindness. In other words, the failure to notice something that is completely visible because of a lack of attention. So now, how many passes did you count? Again, here you have a red cross, and for these participants, again, the correct answer is 15 passes. Which is initially, they did not notice the red cross.
Did anybody see the gorilla?
Red cross? That's always the question. Passed before them, because their attention was focused on the black or white figure. Now, take your eyes off of the ball being passed around. You'll see the gorilla kind of come through. Again, this is research from Daniel Simmons and Christopher Chapris. Okay, so one of the things you'll come across is the fact that, initially, if our mind is so focused, and that's where we always talk about that. We always talk about those elements. Is the element that a lot of times we're so focused on a given either a scenario or a given outlook, and we begin to miss things. We begin to miss things that are happening around us, and that's where individuals, say for example, go into inattentive blindness by way of, say for example, sometimes we get into inattentive blindness by way of driving to work or driving to school or driving to wherever we need to go. We've gone through those same motions so many times that we initially think, okay, I don't have to really think about it. I just have to focus on this, and this, and the key elements. And sometimes we miss the things that are happening around us, and that's where a lot of times a lot of the accidents happen, is because we initially think, okay, I can bypass this and this and this. The same thing also happens, say for example, for cell phone use. You have individuals who are driving and are also texting. The outlook is that I'm seeing everything. I'm seeing the road, and I look up and I see the road, and I look down and I can quickly text, and then I look back up. Again, that's where the inattentive blindness happens. Initially, sometimes we only see what is on the road, but we forget to look off to the right or to the left, and we forget that there are other people that may be merging onto the road, or there may be an individual that passes us, and we may simply think, okay, I'm going to be so focused on this that initially I'm going to be focused on my phone, and within that we lose our attention initially loses that element where we are aware, and so that's where we can. That's where a lot of times the accidents do happen as well. Alrighty, so factors affecting perception. Again, a motivation. What is motivation?
So
This is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. In the Mueller-Lyer illusion, lines appear to be different.
So visual and auditory
lengths,
stimuli,
although they are identical.
Of waves.
So if you two physical properties of waves are amplitude and wavelength. So again, the amplitude are So here you have perception of color. Again, you have wavelength and color. Different wavelengths of light are associated with our perception of different colors. Again, you have individuals who are also colorblind. So again, that can also impact their perception of color. So for example, longer wavelengths would be red. Intermediate wavelengths are green, and shorter wavelengths are blue and violet. So initially you can kind of see the initial intensity, the amplitude and color. The amplitude of light waves associated with brightness as well as intensity of color. Larger amplitudes appear brighter. So now here are sound waves. When you look at the frequency of an initial sound wave, again, that's still considered the pitch. The high frequency is a higher pitch sound. Low frequency, low pitch sound. The audible range of sound frequencies in humans is between 20 to 2,000 hertz. The amplitude in decibels, amplitude of sound waves, in other words, the loudness of it. This is where we have individuals. One of the big things you're always looking at is concern for auditory deafness. And so initially that's one of the things you're always looking out for. So higher amplitude initially are the louder sounds. Louder sounds, if you look at rock concerts, it's 120 decibels. So initially the potential for hearing loss or hearing damage is 80 to 130 decibels. The lower amplitudes are the quieter noises. So a typical conversation is about 60 decibels. Primarily you want to stay in that range. But again, when you look at it, also prolong listening to, again, that's one of the biggest things is everybody wants earbuds, the wireless earbuds. And again, they're good. They're awesome. But at the same time, you also want to limit how long you have the earbuds in. In addition to that, you also want to make sure that you're not listening to music at a high amplitude, because initially they can impact your ability to hear at a later time. And again, one of the things that I always notice is even just working on the reservation and working with high schoolers. One of the biggest things is you have students that are walking around with their earbuds, and this was before COVID. So initially, and again, you still see it here and there. Again, a lot of teenagers are using a lot of their earbuds, and so when it's in, again, it's you have noise canceling. So again, it cancels out the initial noise around them. The fear is that when that happens, is the individual is initially placing all that noise and all that sound into a directed location. Therefore, it impacts them in terms of having them. Because one of the things I'm always noticing on the reservation is a lot of students are using their earbuds, but you can hear what they're listening to. And when you can hear what they're listening to, then you kind of notice, okay, this kid is, listening at a higher amplitude, which then impacts their ability to, at a later time, listen. And that's where you have individuals, and I see it also on the reservation where you have individuals blasting their music, and you can hear it in their vehicle. And if you can hear it in the vehicle, again, you have those elements of you're damaging your eardrum. And when that happens again, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, but one of the biggest things is you don't want to damage it, because if you damage it, again, it's not like other forms of corrective surgery and stuff like that. So say, for example, for vision loss, you have corrective surgery, but for the ears, initially it's whatever you get from the moment you're born all the way till now, initially is what you get. So there's no necessarily any surgery that can initially correct that. So if you have it at a high rate, initially impacts you. So that's one of the things. That's where you have individuals that at even a younger age, 30, 40, 50 years old, that are having to turn to hearing aids due to the fact that they damaged their eardrum. And again, I'll talk about that in the next slide. So again, here you have sound waves. So 140 is harmful. So initially you have the pain threshold. Then you have hearing loss right in that 120 to 100 decibels. And then you start going down. The blender is right in there. So you have 180, 80 decibels. And then you have the normal conversation, which is roughly about 60. Then you have soft music. In other words, jazz. For me, it's jazz. Then you have whispering. It goes even below that. And then you have also the leaves blowing and everything else. Again, that would be in the 20. And then you have the hearing threshold of 0. So initially it illustrates the loudness of the various common sounds overall. So here's this, hearing loss and the impacts. Hearing trouble muffles other people's speech. What was said is I asked Skip if he felt sick. And this is what happens for individuals. And this is where... for older individuals, again, you're having to work around this. Not everybody's comfortable utilizing hearing aids, and it's just one of those things where you see the psychology of that. Because individuals, when I work with individuals, and even I have family that initially, even as a counselor, you're trying to encourage them to utilize various hearing tools and everything else to help them. But again, it's also the psychological element of, at one point I used to hear everything, now I can't, and now you're asking me to utilize a hearing aid, and I don't want to use a hearing aid because I'm not old, or I'm not. And again, it's one of those things where you have all these different psychological elements that go into the aspect of hearing loss. So again, you have how noise causes permanent hearing damage. So again, you have the cells here, the hair cells. So again, the sound vibrates the eardrum and the tiny bones of the ear, which in turn vibrate the hair cells in the inner ear. So initially what happens is, if you're listening to sound at a high amplitude, what can happen is it damages the hair cells, which then impacts your ability to hear. So here you have the whole sound aspect again. And these are just the different areas. 85 is the approximate point of which extended exposure can cause hearing damage. Again, it's one of those things where individuals, so you're right in the area of traffic noise inside a car as well as leaf blower. So right in that little range, that's where it can cause hearing damage. And that's where you have a lot of young individuals blasting their music at a high rate. And at the point, they're simply looking at it as, I'm young, and it's not going to, I'm not really worried about it now. But when they do have hearing loss at a young age, again, that's where they're suddenly looking back thinking, I wish I had taken care of my ears when I was growing up and everything else. Again, that's one of the things you're always looking at, is the psychology of how that can impact you. So now vision. Our eyes take in sensory information that helps us understand the world around us. Because again, we see different things. We see, even on the reservation, when you come back, when you're in the evening time, you see the sun setting. You see all these different things around us, and that's how we initially interpret the world around us. We're very visual learners as well. So initially, the light waves are transmitted across the cornea and enter through the pupil. So again, you have the cornea right in there, and the pupil, and it goes all the way through. The pupil side is controlled by muscles that are connected to the iris, the colored part of the eye. The light crosses the lens and is focused on the fovea, which is part of the retina. So in the back end, you have the fovea. The fovea contains photoreceptors. So again, the photoreceptors are connected to the retinal ganglion cells. Axons from these cells exit through the back of the eye, where they form the optic nerve. So again, the optic nerve primarily carries the visual information to the brain. So what we see is initially all of that happening instantaneously. So again, you also have the blind spots. So these are the point of no receptors, where information exits the eye, where we cannot respond to visual information. So initially, this is where we have areas where we can't see past the initial corner of our eye and everything else. Again, that's where primarily it does not initially respond. So here's the anatomy of the visual system. So you have the posterior cavity, you have the anterior cavity, and the ciliary body. And so initially within that you have the lens, and as you're looking at this, it kind of just has a better visualization of initially what your eye, what is entailed in your eye itself. And I cannot express that I am an expert in the area of the visual system, but I will leave this here for you, because initially my understanding is more of the mind, not necessarily the eye. But again, you can see the impacts. Say, for example, if a person goes blind, the interpretation is what happens to the world around me. Does the world simply shut down? And the reality is, no, it doesn't. And again, we're always looking at the aspect of visual safety. That's the reason why we encourage a lot of individuals, if they're playing a lot of high impact sports, to ensure that they have eye coverings and everything else. And that's primarily what you're always looking at. So the photoreceptors. So again, the cones. So if you look at it, you have the cones and you have the rods. So the phototopic, in other words, daytime vision, works best in bright light conditions. In other words, high acuity and color formation, located in the fovea. So as you noted back, initially that's at the back of the eye itself. Then you have the rods. So this is the scotopic nighttime vision. Again, this works best in low light conditions. This is where even at nighttime you can still see. Even in really low light, you can still see and make out various shapes. High sensitivity allows for low acuity vision in dim light. So again, both of these are needed in order for you to see. Again, it's one of those things where you want to make sure that your nighttime acuity is also good. Say, for example, even during the fall season, you can see a change in the lighting system, which then impacts your ability to see low light and also daytime light as well, or nighttime vision and also daytime. So initially in the fall, sometimes you see this change in the evening sky, which impacts your ability to differentiate. Sometimes it's a mixture of daytime light and also evening light, and therefore it kind of has that level of almost initial blindness as you're driving along. So now here's the optic nerve of each eye, which merges at the optic chiasm, an egg-shaped structure just below the cerebral cortex. So initially, the information from the right visual field is sent to the left hemisphere and vice versa. This information is sent to the occipital lobe for processing. So here you have it. So again, you have the eye, which then passes over to the left side, and the left eye passes over to the right side. And so initially that's what you're looking at. This illustration shows the optic chiasm as the front of the brain and the pathway to the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, where visual sensations are processed into meaningful perceptions. So after being processed in the occipital lobe, visual information exits and goes through two different pathways. Initially the what pathway, as well as the where and how. So this is object recognition and object identification, in other words, the what. And then the where and how. Where did it happen? Location in space, and how one might interact with a particular visual stimulus. In other words, how will I interact with it? Say, for example, if I notice a person coming in with, my best example would be, say, for example, dinner time. You initially interpret what is for dinner. In other words, the object recognition, and then you identify what it is, and then a location in space. So therefore, you're like, okay, this is. I know that at this time, for evening time, this is what we're going to have for dinner normally, and therefore I locate in space, and then how one might interact with a particular visual stimulus. Therefore I see it, therefore I know what it is, and within that I will possibly enjoy it or I will not enjoy it. The food, that is. That's the example goes. So here's the support for opponent process theory. So again, when staring at a colored stimulus, the color pairings of the opponent process theory led to a negative afterimage. So within that, the best way to look at it is to look at that initial dot. So stare at the white dot for 30 to 60 seconds and then remove your eyes to a blank piece of white paper. What you're going to see is the afterimage. In other words, a continuation of a visual sensation after the removal of the stimulus. So now, depth perception. So what is that? I think that's one of the things we're always looking at. So say, for example, if you're getting older, the aspect of depth perception begins to wane. And even for children, depth perception is initially not there. Or it is there, but it's one of those things where their visual stimulus is still processing all the information around them. So again, what is depth perception? Our ability to perceive spatial relationships in 3D. So again, depth cues of a visual scene are used to establish our sense of depth. So we look at other referencing points. And within those referencing points, we begin to notice how far along, various the distances between various objects are. So again, you have the binocular cues, a cue that relies on the use of both eyes. Within that, you have binocular disparity. So initially, the slightly different view of the world that each eye receives. Again, this can also happen when, say, for example, your eyes is perceiving two different elements around them. And again, that's where you have that initial disparity. So then you have also the monocular cues, a cue that rely on only one eye. So again, within that, you have linear perspective, when two parallel lines seem to converge, as well as interposition, the partial overlap of objects. So here we have, we perceive depth in a two-dimensional figure, like this one, through the use of monocular cues like linear perspective. Within that, so the use of monocular cues like the linear perspective, which we utilize the parallel lines converging as the road narrows in the distance. So color blindness. So again, you have this. You have three different circles, and if you look at the coloring for individuals who are colorblind, the ability to differentiate the colors within the actual circles are initially their ability to differentiate is initially skewed. So the first one you have 12, second one you have 74, third one you have 42. Hopefully you see those numbers. Again, it's one of those things where with color blindness, the ability to differentiate the colors is again, as noted, skewed. So now, moving into the anatomy of the auditory system. So again, it's broken up into three divisions. You have the outer, middle, and then the inner. The inner. So you have the pinna and also the tympanic membrane. And within that, you have the middle, which is the three ossicles, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And then you have the inner. So you have the cochlea and the basilar membrane. And primarily that's where you have the membrane, that's where you have primarily the hairs. And when, as noted before, if the hairs get damaged, it can impact your ability to hear. So here's a better breakdown of the initial ear itself. And you have the auricle, the ear canal. And that's where we also have the aspect of, and I think that's one of the things a lot of individuals utilize, is Q-tips. And again, you can also burst your eardrum when forcing it farther and farther into your ear to get the earwax out. And within that, it's one of the things you always try to look at. And for kids, again, you're also wanting to make sure that you're not causing any distress to the ear itself or the inner ear canal. So, moving forward. So again, the auditory transduction. Sound waves travel along the auditory canal and strike the tympanic membrane, causing it to vibrate. The vibration causes the three ossicles to move. This presses the stapes into the oval window of the cochlea. So again, the fluid inside the cochlea begins to move, stimulating the hair cells, which become activated. The hair cells generate neural impulses that travel along the auditory nerve to the brain. Within the auditory information is sent to the inferior colliculus. And then the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and finally to the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe for processing. So here you have the pitch perception. How does the auditory system differentiate among various pitches? So again, you have two different theories. So you have the temporal theory. Frequency is coded by the activity level of a sensory neuron. The only issue is that the frequency of action potentials cannot account for the entire range that we are able to hear. There is a point at which a cell cannot fire any faster. And then you have the place theory. Different portions of the basilar membrane are sensitive to sounds of different frequencies. The base responds to high frequencies, and the tip responds to low frequencies. Both theories explain different aspects of pitch perception. Again, the rate of action potentials applies up to about 4,000 hertz, but higher frequencies can only be encoded using place cues. So sound localization. Localizing sound involves the use of two cues. The binaural cues, initially one ear. Each ear interacts with incoming sound waves differently. And then you have the binaural cues. So in other words, two ears provide information on the location of sound along a horizontal axis. Relies on different patterns and differences in patterns of vibration. Interaural level difference. Sound coming from one side of the body is more intense at the closest ear because of the attenuation of the sound waves as it passes through the head. And the interaural timing difference, small difference of the time at which a given sound waves arrives at each ear. Say for example, the sonic boom also plays into that. Then you also have the visualization. So again, those are all the things that kind of play into our ability to interpret sound itself. So yeah, hearing loss. So for deafness, the partial or complete inability to hear, primarily that's the definition of it. Then you have congenital deafness. In other words, children are initially from birth, you have individuals who primarily are deaf. And then you have conductive hearing loss. Again, this is associated with the failure of the vibration of the eardrum and or movement of the ossicles. Can often be dealt with using hearing aids. And then it also can be caused by age, genetic predispositions. Say, for example, you're predisposed to various genetic factors, which then make you more susceptible to contracting hearing loss. Then you also have environmental effects, exposure to extreme noises, certain illnesses, or damage due to toxins. Again, this also plays in. So say, for example, if you have music playing at a high rate, again, it can impact your ability to hear. And then you have sensory neural hearing loss. So in other words, failure to transmit neural signals from the cochlea to the brain. And this can be caused by Meniere's disease, which results in degeneration of inner ear structures. So that's one of the things you're also taking into account. So here is a video, a brief video, and I'll play it, and you can initially watch. Ready?
Hi, it's Joey Remini here. I'm a vestibular audiologist from seekingbalance.com.au, and today I'm going to be talking about Meniere's disease or Meniere's syndrome, and this is a condition of the inner ear. So when people are diagnosed with Meniere's, they usually have it in only one ear, and they experience a low pitch or low frequency hearing loss. They'll often report roaring tinnitus sounds in that one ear only, and they'll also have intermittent bouts of quite severe vertigo, and also fullness in the ear, so they feel like there's a blockage or a pressure within that ear. Now the reason for that is because Meniere's is a production of potassium fluid and there's too much of it in the inner ear. And I want to tell you a little bit about the healthy ear first, and this will help you understand Meniere's. So we have this potassium fluid called endolymph floating around our inner ear, and it's absolutely essential to help us hear and to help us balance. We've got this fluid moving and creating vibrational signals of the inner ear. Now those signals are sent to our brain and they tell us that it's sound or words or speech or movement and balance information. So the potassium's not a problem, it's essential for our inner ear function. However, for people with Meniere's, they overproduce it, so the ear gets so excited that it actually has a storage sac called the endolymphatic sac, and it balloons open and fills up with fluid because for some reason, and we think there might be both genetic components and environmental or lifestyle stresses that create this abnormality of the inner ear. So it just keeps making fluid. It doesn't stop. It doesn't seem to recognize that it has enough. And so it fills up and people say, I feel like there's fullness in my ear. And it can balloon and start to press upon the hearing areas of the inner ear, creating the hearing loss or the fluctuating hearing loss. So as it balloons open, we become more deaf. And as it reduces back to normal, we return to normal. Now, in severe instances, you can get hours of spinning because there's actually a rupture of the membrane, and that special potassium fluid toxically mixes with the architecture of the inner ear. So you can get permanent damage to both the balance centers, areas of balance in the inner ear, and permanent damage to your hearing. Now, all of that you will be able to see on your audiology testing or vestibular testing. So there will be real evidence of your Meniere's because of that permanent damage. Now, the good news is the body is so clever, it relearns how to reset its balance pathways using the residual function of your damaged ear and the normal function of your non-affected ear. So you can certainly return to normal balance function, and it would be a really good idea to have a daily program. Maybe give yourself 12 weeks and reset your balance pathways using very gentle vestibular exercises. For hearing loss, hearing aids are probably your best bet if you're finding it difficult to hear in daily life to help recuperate that lost permanent hearing damage. Everyone with Meniere's has a different recovery journey. You can return to a normal life with full confidence and full balance. And some people see doctors and try medications. It's different for everybody. Not everybody is going to require medication. Some people would naturally heal without requiring any of the ongoing or long-term medications. So it's encouraged that you talk with your medical practitioners and get a holistic support program. If it's left untreated and you're dealing with uncertainty daily, it can lead to chronic anxiety and depression issues and isolation feelings. So highly encourage you to reach out to your support networks. There are plenty of us around the world able to help you through your recovery process and to use neuroplasticity to build new balance pathways to help you return to feeling normal again, despite the permanent damage. So you can return to normal despite the fact there's permanent damage. So I hope this has been helpful. Reach out and get the supports you need. And it's a little bye for now.
Awesome. Hopefully that answers some questions about Meniere's disease. So as we continue onwards, we'll continue onwards. So conductive hearing loss. Again, as noted, there are various environmental factors that can lead to conductive hearing loss. Loud music, even say for example, working on various construction sites. That's one of the things that can be seen and also can be felt by way of hearing loss. You have individuals who, and that's one of the things. For me personally, I like to build stuff and everything else. I'm always outside. And so when I'm working, I utilize a lot of my impact drivers. So initially within that, again, that can also impact the element of hearing loss. And so within that is one of the things that can impact you. So therefore, the next step is to always practice safety. Therefore, using the earplugs and everything else to make sure that there are no negative impacts that are happening to my initial hearing. As I continue onwards. And I think that's one of the biggest things you're always trying to do is take care of initially what you have now. So now the chemical senses. So taste and smell are known as the chemical senses. Both have sensory receptors that respond to molecules in the food we eat or in the air we breathe. And I think that's one of the things we come across, and it brings across, and we'll talk about the memories and everything else. But as we continue onwards, we're looking at the aspect of initially how do we taste, and now also how do we smell, and a lot of this plays into our ability to interpret the world around us. So research demonstrates that we have about 6 grouping of tastes. So we have sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, associated with a taste for monosodium glutamate, and some research suggests we possess a taste for the fatty content of food. Again, if you are like me when I was younger, say for example when you grill steak or grill pork chops, the fat content that's left over after it's been grilling, you used to get some tortilla and then soak that up and everything else. Again, it's one of those things where maybe it's just me, I don't know, but it's one of those things where initially you develop a taste for it. And also when we look at our taste buds, the grouping of taste receptors, the cells with the hair-like extensions that protrude in the central pore of the taste buds, again, they have a life cycle of 10 days to 2 weeks. So now, the transduction. So the taste molecules bind to receptors and cause chemical changes within the sensory cell. These changes result in neural impulses being sent to the brain. And primarily it's trying to differentiate whether it's sweet, salty, sour, bitter. So that's primarily what you're looking at. So, a more in-depth look. Here are the taste pores, the tongue surface, the taste receptor cells, and the nerves. Taste buds are composed of a number of individual taste receptors that transmit information to the nerves. This micrograph shows a close-up view of the tongue surface. Again, that's there for you to look at. So here is the olfactory smell for olfactory portion. Again, we have olfactory receptors. Again, they contain small hair-like extensions and located in a mucous membrane at the top of the nose. So again, all of this helps us in terms of our ability to smell and differentiate between those different smells. So again, when you look at the transduction aspect, the odor molecules bind to receptors. Chemical changes causes signals to be sent to the olfactory bulb, and information is sent to the limbic system, and that's where the primary olfactory cortex is. And primarily it's sent to the primary olfactory cortex. So within that you have the aspect of even pheromones. So you have individuals who utilize pheromones to initially for the mate selection. Again, there's various debates over the aspect of pheromones, but again, it is a key topic that can still be explored later on in the future. Again, these are chemical messages sent by one individual to another through the use of the initial pheromones that are disseminated. Again, that's where our olfactory, and from an evolutionary perspective, again, this would be an element of prolonging the aspect of your lineage or your prolongment of life. So here is thermoception and nociception, as well as the receptors located in the skin. There are numbers of free nerve endings that have sensory functions. So again, you have thermoception, which is temperature perception. So say, for example, if it gets too hot, again, we know those things. If it gets too cold, and primarily we're always trying to make sure that our bodies are in that homeostatic element. And then you have nociception, which is a sensory signal indicating potential harm and possibly pain. So here you have a little indicator of a nail going into the skin, which then sends it up and through the spinal cord directly to the brain. Within that, it sends it specifically to the medulla, the thalamus, and the somatosensory cortex. So again, this is where we're looking at the fight or flight response of the body to initially protect us from harm and our surrounding environment. So again, you have pain perception. You have inflammatory pain, neuropathic pain, and within that you also have the impacts of what is considered congenital insensitivity to pain. So the inflammatory pain is primarily tissue damage. Neuropathic pain, initially damage to neurons of either the peripheral or the central nervous system. And so for congenital insensitivity to pain, the danger is the fact that a lot of times they have individuals who have this disorder initially have a shorter life expectancy because one, they don't necessarily, they initially can put themselves in harm's way, and in addition to that, they're at a higher rate of being injured. So here you have what is considered the vestibular sense. So again, this contributes to our ability to maintain balance and body posture. Again, these are individuals, if there is any, moving forward, the major sensory organ of the vestibular system are located next to the cochlea and the inner ear. Again, these organs are fluid-filled and contain hair cells, which respond to movement of the head and gravitational forces. So now, Gestalt principles of perception. So within Gestalt psychology, the field of psychology based on the idea that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. Again, when we look at the brain creates a perception that is more than simply the sum of available sensory inputs. The brain does this in predictable ways, which Gestalt psychologists translate into principles by which we organize sensory information. Again, the principles include figure to ground relationship, proximity, similarity, continuity, and closure. So, the figure-ground relationship. Again, the idea that we tend to segment our visual world into figures and ground. In other words, the focus of the visual field. And you also have what is considered the ground, in other words, the background. Our perception can vary depending on what we view as figure and what we view as ground. Again, for some individuals they see a vase, for some individuals they see two faces. Again, that's where we're looking at the perceptions. So, Gestalt principle of proximity, the idea that things that are close to one another tend to be grouped together. Say, for example, A versus B, one block of dots on the left side and 3 columns on the right side. So now, the Gestalt principle of similarity, the idea that things that are alike tend to be grouped together. We have those that are in the cream-colored row, then you have some in the blue. When looking at this array of dots, we likely perceive alternative rows of color. And then the Gestalt principle of continuity, the idea that we are more likely to perceive continuous, smooth, flowing lines rather than jagged, broken lines. Again, good continuation would suggest that we are more likely to perceive this as 2 overlapping lines rather than 4 lines meeting in the center. And after I told you that, you're probably looking at it now and thinking, wow, these are 4 lines that meet in the center, therefore it would be jagged. Versus the continuity, where we simply see a flow from one end to the other and vice versa. So now, the Gestalt principle of closure. Closure suggests that we will perceive a complete circle and rectangle rather than a series of segments. If you notice, for the circle, we fill in the initial missing parts, and the same thing applies for the square, or the rectangle, actually. So yeah, duck or rabbit. Take a look at the following figure. How might you influence whether people see a duck or a rabbit? Which one would you utilize? If you look at one end, it looks like a duck, and you look at the other, it looks like a rabbit. So herein is implicit bias and perception. Again, our perception is built from senses and influenced by experiences, biases, and even our own culture. Again, here are a few characteristics of implicit bias. Implicit biases are pervasive. In other words, everyone possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartially to judge impartiality. So initially, these would be judges. Even for ourselves, we all have various biases. And then herein you have implicit and explicit biases, which are related but distinct mental constructs. They are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. Again, you have the implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. And we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. Through research, though research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our own in-group as well. Implicit biases are malleable. Again, our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can be gradually unlearned through a variety of debiasing techniques. Again, all of this does take time, but again, it's one of those things where even within our own bias, even if we hold the element of I am not biased, even holding that staunch element of I am not biased still holds the element of being biased. And primarily within that's one of the things we always tend to look at. Again, here's a question. What might this say about law enforcement, educational, and jury perception of defendants of different races? Within my psych and law course, we kind of go through those various elements of biases, both implicit as well as explicit, and we kind of just break it down in terms of what things can be learned from our initial biases, and so long as we are able to change it, modify it, so that we're able to help others. So hopefully this kind of this brief video, hopefully this kind of shared some insight into, I believe it's chapter 5. Again, I can never express the fact that I am an expert in the area of the ocular and also the olfactory nerves and everything else. But again, it's one of those things where that's the reason why I have a lot of the different elements in there to kind of showcase from experts that are out there the initial outlook regarding even just perception. So again, hopefully that offers some level of understanding as we continue onwards within the course.